Welcome to hour 14. I'm here to give George a brief break. So you just watched a couple of my sociological colleagues speaking on issues that have been interwoven with so much of what we've seen today. It connects with what happened most recently to Jacob Blake and others in Wisconsin. We shouldn't have to remind people every day that Black lives matter. I don't want to take too much time because we have so much content, but I did want to introduce myself. My name is Alia Tyner Mullings. I'm a sociologist and the chapter chair at Stella and Charles Guttman Community College, which is still CUNY's newest community college. I'm also a member of the PSC exec and the bargaining team. And I'm the third generation of my family to both learn and teach at CUNY. When my grandfather received his degree in accounting from City College, CUNY was free. When my mother and her three sisters and brother got their degrees at CUNY, it was free. And that was the only reason why a 34-year-old Black man who would be fired from job after job just before he reached the required number of hours to become certified would be able to get a degree. Why my grandmother was able to get a degree and become a nurse. Why their children who grew up in projects on the Lower East Side were later able to attend and graduate from the school. And that led to my mother and one of my aunts teaching here full time and another aunt who adjuncted. Black lives mattered then, Black lives still matter. And I teach at CUNY because I believe that and because I want to make the changes in the lives of my students as CUNY did in the lives of my mother and my grandparents. CUNY needs to take care of its faculty and staff so that we can take care of its students. So now I'm going to send you off to an op-ed on a tale of two New York City budgets. And George will be back with you in a couple of hours.
My name's Evan Turiano, and I'm a PhD candidate in history at the Graduate Center, a writing fellow at LaGuardia Community College, and an adjunct lecturer in history at Queens College. The last several months have seen a flurry of crises. These include, of course, the pandemic, a national reckoning with racist policing, and an increase in nativist rhetoric and policies. I've been asked to speak here today at the PSC Demands Justice event because I've done some writing in recent months for Jacobin and the Queens Daily Eagle on how each crisis intersects with higher ed and specifically with CUNY. I hope to try to make sense today of what I see as common ground across those crises. First, they all cast a sharp light on how years of austerity have left institutions of higher education like ours woefully unable to withstand external crises. Each shows how, for a long time, problems we face in education have been framed as innovation problems, or growth problems, or personnel problems, when in reality what we've had for a long time is a drastic, unjust funding problem. And each crisis shows that public, well-funded, equitable education can and should be a lifeline for the most vulnerable in our community, and that when our institutions are at risk, so are they. First, the pandemic. Since May, Governor Cuomo has shown a willingness to cozy up to the ed tech industry who seek to take advantage of the crisis as a market opportunity in the education sector. For decades, corporate education reformers have argued that American schools don't have a resource problem but an innovation problem. They need to be disrupted using technology, charter schools, and other privatization schemes. Silicon Valley has been happy to oblige, jumping into the mix and arguing that private sector innovation and digital technology can fix American schools without raising taxes. As of February, even before the bulk of school closures, the edtech industry was projected to pull in more than $250 billion this year. Cuomo's new education czar, Bill Gates, is a big player here. One of his largest education grants in the last decade was more than $85 million in 2011 that was used to launch a service called In Bloom. The idea behind In Bloom was that schools would pool student data that private developers could then use to build apps and technology, which then they would sell back to school districts. Within a year, parent groups and education activists across the country, and particularly here in New York City, organized to kill In Bloom. In an October 2012 letter to state officials, a coalition of New York advocate groups called the sharing of student data and its potential use for commercial purposes a, quote, non-consensual disclosure of intimate facts about school children in exchange for promises of untested, unspecified learning tools that may or may not have been created, or if they are, may not improve children educationally. The In Bloom fight shows that under normal conditions, progressive activists stand ready to block private sector incursions into American schooling. But pandemic conditions, Cuomo knows, are not normal. This is where the crisis comes in. It's Naomi Klein's famous formulation of disaster capitalism. Just like the dismantling of New Orleans' public schools in exchange for school vouchers in the wake of Katrina, private sector edtech boosters like Gates hope that the unprecedented challenges we face in the classroom today will lead politicians to give up critical control and oversight to corporations looking for a profit with little or no input from educators. Many of us have already seen what this looks like in the last several months. Massive cuts to teacher budgets while schools pay mightily for invasive proctoring services and pie-in-the-sky tech solutions. In 1982, the famous titan of conservative economics, Milton Friedman, wrote that, quote, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. The type of change," he said, quote, "depends on the ideas that are lying around." Gates's unregulated, privatized vision of American education is practically sitting in Cuomo's lap. It's on us to make sure it's not the only available option. The role that our institutions can and must play in protecting vulnerable communities was made very clear last month, to move on to sort of another crisis of the last couple of months, when the Trump administration issued an ICE directive stating that international students in the United States would be deported if their colleges remained online because of the COVID-19 pandemic. ICE, of course, rescinded the new rules in the wake of lawsuits and a groundswell of popular opposition, but the order still proved a powerful point. For a moment, schools were forced to choose between risking the lives of their students, faculties, and communities, and losing their international students. These students, Trump proved beyond a reasonable doubt, could be used as political pawns. How did international students end up in this situation as bargaining chips, not just as individuals, but as moneymakers vital to the survival of American universities? Once again, surprise, surprise, it's a story of austerity. Between 1996 and 2012, state funding dropped for public colleges by about 10%. The Great Recession gave states an opportunity to turbocharge austerity. Lawmakers imposed cuts and then simply never reversed them. Funding currently sits about $9 billion below its pre-recession levels. In search of new revenue streams, colleges met a neoliberal problem, austerity, with a neoliberal solution, which is corporate globalization. As state spending fell, international tuition dollars at public universities jumped up by about 12%. Tuition from international students now makes up a full 28% of public university revenue, 40% more than it did just a decade ago. Since 2008, many colleges have settled into this happy, if tentative, new normal of relying on international student tuition dollars to keep the lights on. State funding never recovered, faculty hiring remained stagnant, but revenue grew on the backs of international students. But, like other parts of the neoliberal status quo, Trump's election shook this sort of financial tuition scheme to its foundations. With the International Students Directive, Trump found an opportunity to lash out in several directions at once. Excluding foreign students from American university played into his nativist brand and into the American rights, in particular, anti-Chinese sentiment. Dealing colleges a crushing blow allowed Trump to get back at the liberal elite academics that are an object of his ire, and pushing colleges into dangerous reopenings in the name of their own survival would enable him to advance his goal of restoring some sense of normalcy ahead of the November elections. International students, of course, would have bore the brunt of Trump's order. On the university side, smaller local public colleges in particular would have faced financial ruin for many of these schools. An online semester without international student revenue would have meant an imminent closure. International students in colleges, maybe for now in those senses, can breathe a sigh of relief, but both were susceptible for the same simple reason, which is the privatization of public universities. If our institutions could rely on a stable and robust stream of state funding, we would have been better positioned to serve our students and to shield them from powerful political demagogues. Finally, CUNY's summer of struggle and the cuts that precipitated it have come in the context of a reckoning in this city and all over the country over policing, white supremacy, and fundamentally who American democracy is for. Our drastic cuts have been met with what is at this point a familiar refrain. We hear that the budget doesn't exist, that cuts are the only way out of the crisis. That is, of course, the politics of cuts and of financial austerity at work. CUNY's leadership has so thoroughly accepted the inevitability of its own financial starvation that it began announcing staff cuts before anyone even saw a state budget. This is, put wisely by Ben Lerner of Brooklyn College, a university so beaten down by, quote, the backward logic of austerity that it responds to crises by attacking itself. I, and presumably all of you, know that cuts are not the only way out. But even if we believe that for a moment, doing so quickly became impossible when we watched this summer the NYPD roll out its weapons of war. New Yorkers protesting the murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis cop have been met by consistent, swift, and brutal force of law enforcement. The entirety of NYPD's force, over 50,000 officers, was deployed in 12-hour shifts, which the force described as, quote, a wartime measure. Anyone who has experienced New York City austerity politics will notice a few things about the police in viral videos of their violence against protesters that we all have seen. They appear with weapons and protective gear that resemble a military more than a municipal police force. Behind the scenes, we know that unprecedented surveillance and facial recognition technology guide NYPD decision-making. These are the fruits of a $6 billion law enforcement budget that has, between 2013 and last year, increased by a full $1 billion. These sorts of videos are incredible to contrast against images of nurses using trash bags as personal protective equipment, or against the experiences of anyone affiliated with CUNY. If we didn't already know it, this summer has made it clear that New York City public services do not need to starve. The fact that they do is a damning indictment of who our leaders think the city belongs to. The wealthiest New Yorkers who do not send their children to our public schools or colleges, do not ride our public transit, and do not avail of our social safety net have fought since the Giuliani years to orient city services towards the preservation of law and order and the protection of private property. Now the products of that unequal spending are being wielded against working-class New Yorkers that have been failed by public spending in almost every respect. This is an injustice that makes the present powder keg feel almost inevitable. This is, however, I think, not a story without hope. The city can be made to work for the majority of New Yorkers, and public pressure has and can continue to force leaders to redirect funds away from policing and towards schools. Teacher strikes across the nation over the last several years have reasserted worker power in our sector and won meaningful gains. Teachers, I think, fight aside a left that is bigger and perhaps more organized than it's been in 2 generations. We need to use that power to push a democratic vision of public education in our institution, in our city, and beyond. Privatization and market-friendly disruptions aren't the only responses to this crisis. So this is, in some ways we're in the middle, or maybe even, the beginning of a long asymmetric fight in which meaningful redistribution remains somewhat unlikely. But we must not forget, and I do think in some ways the summer has shown, that the resources that CUNY needs do exist, and that leaders remain answerable to constituents if loud voices can drown out deep pockets. Thanks to the PSC for putting on this event, and solidarity as we carry on in the fight.
Hello, my name is Dr. Anthony Brown, and I'm the chair of the Department of Africana and Puerto Rican Latino Studies at Hunter College. I'm also the chair of the Association of CUNY Black Faculty and Staff.
Hi, my name is Dr. Dion Bennett, and I'm an assistant professor in the African American Studies Department at New York City College of Technology, and I am also a member of the association.
Our association is proud to support CUNY workers and students who make the City University of New York one of the most dynamic vehicles for upward social mobility in the entire country. Informed by a rich and enduring intellectual tradition, the mission of the Association of CUNY Black Faculty and Staff is to support the academic and professional development of Black faculty, staff, students, and alumni across the City University of New York, and to serve as a resource for the recruitment, retention, advancement, and growth of these constituencies. Historically, Black, Africana, African diaspora studies departments and programs have had a mission and purpose that combine social justice with intellectual excellence. We are invested in sustaining the legacy that we've inherited, as well as our effort to engage and serve communities which our campuses reside in. The goal of the association is to share knowledge, create opportunities, and build thriving communities, both within and beyond CUNY. A commitment to diverse communities is institutionalized and required both in the CUNY mission and in New York State education law. Black studies departments and programs and Black students, staff, and faculty play an essential role in CUNY's effort to fulfill its commitment to diversity and inclusion. As we work with CUNY to honor its commitment to diversity, the association that Black studies departments and programs, as well as faculty, play are critical in serving the intellectual, academic, social, cultural, and professional needs of all members of CUNY's community.
Our association approaches our work from an intersectional perspective, a recognition of the interrelated and complex identities and experiences that are critical to honoring our humanity and our university. While our association is centered on the support of Black faculty and staff, we support members of the CUNY community of all backgrounds, races, ethnicities, genders, sexualities, ages, nationalities, languages, abilities, religions, and beliefs. We recognize, celebrate, and support the diverse CUNY community of which we are all members. Our support for CUNY workers is rooted in the rich but often marginalized or ignored history of Black labor struggle and activism in America. In many ways, the history of the African American struggle for labor rights began the moment Africans arrived on the shores of this continent in chains and began the long, hard, and sometimes deadly work of centuries of both enslaved labor and foundational nation building. The abolitionist movement in this country was primarily a struggle for freedom for slavery, but was also a struggle for the right to dignified, safe, ethical, and justly compensated labor, a right for which people of all races still struggle today. African Americans initiated organized labor activism before the end of slavery when Black Hawkers organized a strike at the Washington Navy Yard back in 1835. The newly freed African American community formed the Colored National Labor Union over 150 years ago in 1869. Black workers have historically faced fiercely racist opposition and discrimination from the segregated wings of the labor movement. However, Black activists like Claudia Jones and A. Philip Randolph were visionary and effective labor rights leaders. It cannot be stated often enough that the civil rights movement was also a labor rights movement. Many forget to state the full name of the 1963 March on Washington, which is the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Leaders like Fannie Lou Hamer and Shirley Chisholm fearlessly led the charge for women's right to work in politics and in leading our democracy. Martin Luther King was assassinated while working on the Poor People's Campaign, in which workers' rights were central, and while he supported the strike of Black sanitation workers who so poignantly marched under the slogan, "I am a man." The Black struggle for freedom over the last 400 years has always also been a struggle for the rights of workers. It was a struggle for workers' rights in the 17th century, and it is a struggle for workers' rights in the 21st century. It makes sense that an association that is rooted in a discipline that was the product of both the civil rights movement and student activism supports the rights of all workers and students at CUNY.
Earlier this year, the association submitted the following list of demands to CUNY's chancellery, and I'll share them with you. We recommended a public statement asserting CUNY's enduring commitment to diversity and inclusion during and after the pandemic. We urged protection from cutbacks, retrenchment, as budget decisions were made that directly affected Black faculty, staff, and students throughout CUNY. The entire community of CUNY has been affected by the insecurity, the instability, and in some cases, the outright fear created by the pandemic. Such a statement of leadership and commitment to inclusion, diversity, equity, and access would calm many of the fears about the upcoming changes and would send a strong message to CUNY administrators of all colleges. Without a clear statement, existing structural challenges that the current administration inherited related to issues of diversity and inclusion will be exacerbated by decisions on the college and departmental levels. These decisions are and will continue to be detrimental to the faculty, staff, and students of color, as well as Black studies departments and programs, and to programs that engage gender and sexuality studies. We recommended that such a statement clearly state support for faculty, members, and staff who are African, Latinx, Asian, Native American, and of Arab descent, who are women and members of religious communities, and who are members of the LGBT community. We also recommended that CUNY make every effort to protect the positions and benefits of adjunct faculty members. Many CUNY adjunct faculty are members of ethnically marginalized communities. The elimination of adjunct faculty positions specifically damages Black studies and other ethnic studies departments that do not have adequate full-time faculty and are dependent upon adjunct faculty to sustain these programs. We believe that structural and cultural change must occur simultaneously. We also recommend that when positions cannot be protected, that the adjunct faculty members are treated at all times with the respect that they deserve. We also recommended a comprehensive and sustained strategy for the recruitment, retention, and promotion of Black faculty. This would include CUNY-wide diversity cluster hires, innovative recruitment and hiring strategies, enhanced support and retention programs for faculty of color throughout their academic careers, and efforts to promote faculty of color to senior faculty ranks and administrative positions. In addition, despite not possessing CUNY's diverse student population or the diversity of New York City, SUNY, our peer institution, developed a program to increase representation of historically underrepresented minority groups. We believe that CUNY should adopt a similar multi-tiered program that is formally constructed, publicly advocated, and consistently funded and implemented. We are aware that senior administration members have developed similar programs at individual colleges. What we would like in addition to that is a CUNY-wide effort at, again, increasing diversity.
Another recommendation we made focused specifically on Africana and Black Studies programs and departments. We recommended the development and application of deliberate strategies to support and retain robust Africana and Black Studies departments and programs. Black New York has played a central role in the development of Black Studies globally as a discipline and in the intellectual life of the country and the world. Peer institutions in the city recognize this and have invested in thriving departments. In order for CUNY to more fully realize its institutional and intellectual potential and obligations, the university must invest in and support Black Studies departments and programs throughout the university and must support the faculty to staff them. We recommend the formation of a master's and PhD degree in Africana and Black Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. Most recently, Columbia developed a department in African American and African Diaspora Studies that has quickly gained national prominence. The Graduate Center should follow suit and develop both a master's and doctorate in Black Studies that will allow the institution to compete with peer institutions around the country. The CUNY system has more than enough accomplished faculty to seamlessly begin offering courses in such a program. We will be able to attract superb faculty and students from throughout the country and the world who would leap at this opportunity to study and work in New York City, despite the challenges we are facing. Black studies and courses at CUNY are an extremely important part of CUNY's intellectual identity and contribute to CUNY's tuition resources, as they are extremely popular with students of all backgrounds. Therefore, we recommend transparent research, documentation, and development of Black Studies courses. There is a need for a more transparent process of how Black Studies courses are offered in general education programs and in the major and minor programs, so that these courses can maximize their potential success. In addition to the knowledge, research, and theory offered by the courses, the faculty members, both full-time and adjunct, who teach the courses are often deeply committed to developing transferable critical research, writing, reading, thinking, and speaking skills that help students of all backgrounds succeed in all of their other courses and in their professional lives. Thus, Black Studies courses at CUNY have emerged as an essential academic skills development course model, as well as courses that prepare students for intellectual and professional success. Yet support in effectively offering the courses as a valuable part of the CUNY curriculum have been uneven at best. We recommend effective documentation of Black Studies programs, departments, and Black faculty hires. Data on Black Studies programs and Black faculty hires with respect to status in colleges need to be more fully documented. This data should not be grouped under area studies, as it sometimes is. We recommend the recruitment and retention of Black faculty, both within and outside of Black Studies programs, and the replacement of retired faculty. Black faculty, both within and outside of Black Studies programs and departments, should be recruited and retained, and after retirement, these faculty member positions should be prioritized for replacement. Most Black Studies departments at CUNY do not have adequate full-time faculty members. We recommend the expansion of Black Studies departments and programs, and that includes the recruitment and retention of new faculty members, the promotion of adjunct faculty to full-time faculty, and the replacement of those who retired or left the institution. It is important to all of us and for all of us to state that we also recommend that CUNY recruit and retain Black faculty members in various departments throughout the university, not just Black Studies. And this includes the STEM disciplines. Some colleges obscure their inability to recruit and retain Black faculty in other departments by relying on Black Studies faculty to improve their superficial diversity numbers. This in turn results in limited efforts to recruit and retain Black faculty outside of Black Studies. We recommend support for robust recruitment, retention, and advancement of Black faculty members at all levels and in all departments. This action will produce intellectual and institutional benefits for people of all backgrounds in CUNY well into the future.
For the protection, development, and advancement of Black staff and administrators, we recommended the following. We recommended that CUNY ensure that a significant percentage of future hires for dean and provost positions across CUNY campuses go to Black candidates, and that CUNY increase Black leadership in senior positions throughout the university. We understand that a number of positions are in the process of being filled or will be filled in the upcoming year. We would like Black candidates to be aggressively recruited and hired for these positions. In addition, while we have been delighted to see diversity, particularly in senior positions at the central office, we are recommending that additional Black administrators be appointed to senior administration roles at the central office. Moreover, we recommend the development of programs that protect, support, and advance Black staff throughout the CUNY system. Like Black adjunct faculty members, Black staff members are often the most vulnerable staff members in the CUNY community. They are often concentrated at the lowest end of the administrative hierarchy. They experience professional insecurity and inequity and have difficulty rising within the administrative hierarchy, even when their positions are secure. We recommend the development of initiatives that protect, support, and advance Black staff throughout CUNY.
We also submitted recommendations regarding students. While the association is not a student organization, our commitment to and belief in students is our most deeply felt, motivating, and enduring value. We are very passionate about this. Therefore, we feel it is our responsibility to also suggest recommendations on behalf of Black students. For the protection, development, and advancement of Black students, we recommend an economic, technological, and emotional resource task force in response to the pandemic. We recommend the establishment of a CUNY-wide task force with student participation to address the impact of the pandemic on our students. We commend CUNY for existing efforts to address the economic and technological needs of students. However, we would like to see more. As you know, most CUNY students work. They work at multiple jobs, and many have lost those jobs due to the pandemic and are unable to work on campus for safety reasons. As a result, New York's already troubling digital divide has been cruelly exacerbated. The resources students need to do their work, including computer hardware, software, and wireless broadband services, are unavailable and unaffordable for many students, many of whom had to leave school due to these conditions. Students of color are particularly vulnerable to these economic challenges. Some of the resources that have been made available had time limitations and were subject to withdrawal. We recommend that CUNY seek out corporate relationships that will help our students access free or very inexpensive hardware, software, and wireless broadband services that they can continue to access throughout the duration of the pandemic and beyond. These relationships in response to the pandemic can grow into future relationships that will benefit the entire institution. We recommend increased mental health care resources for students. Because Black and Latinx communities have been hardest hit by the health consequences of the pandemic, many of our students are grieving from personal losses, including the death of loved ones, and from a range of traumas created by the conditions of the pandemic. Many of our students already suffered from trauma-related concerns, but for economic and, in some cases, cultural reasons or personal reasons, have not received the help they need. As faculty and staff members of color, students of all races often come to us with these concerns, and we have learned that the resources available need to be expanded. While CUNY offers some mental health care services for students, we believe that now is the time to develop those resources more fully in response to the current crisis. We recommend that CUNY enhance and maintain advanced trauma and mental health care services for our students to help them recover from the pandemic. And I would add, to help them address the cruelty that we've encountered in response to state-based violence against Black people that have resulted in the current protests. Moreover, we believe that such resources that are developed during the pandemic can become the foundation for a healthier student population and city, and that they can ultimately have widespread intergenerational mental health benefits for our diverse communities throughout the city. We would like to end the silent segregation of CUNY's educational resources and opportunities, and that includes the distribution of grant resources. We recommend that CUNY become more conscious of and correct what has become a de facto situation of silent segregation for many Black and Latinx students. Despite the significant economic and intellectual contributions to CUNY colleges, Black and Latinx students are often excluded from its most desirable opportunities and resources. For some time, we have observed a decline of Black students at the most selective senior colleges, often due to the over-reliance on the SAT that inaccurately and inadequately represents their extraordinary abilities and potential. Numerous researchers suggest that high school average is a much better predictor of college successes, and we have many students who performed exceptionally in high school. We recommend that all CUNY colleges assess and correct their admission protocols so that they are more fairly representative of the very high quality of our students of all races. They are absolutely brilliant, and they deserve to be recognized for that. We also recommend that all CUNY colleges carefully assess how their most desirable resources are distributed to students across racial and ethnic groups. We are concerned that the segregation of the STEM disciplines is corresponding to a segregation and exclusion from resources and opportunity for Black and Latinx students. The correction of this problem will have a significant impact on individual students and more broadly on CUNY's role in preparing a diverse student population for a technologically complex future. Our association also supports the faculty, staff, and students of Medgar Evers College, which was named after the legendary and visionary civil rights leader. We would add that Mrs. Evers supports the efforts of the faculty and staff and students of Medgar Evers College in their efforts right now. The crisis at Medgar Evers College is perceived by many as representative of CUNY's long history of disparate treatment of Black leadership, institutions, faculty, and departments. Medgar Evers College serves a large Black student community in Brooklyn. It is a ladder of upward mobility for a significant percentage of first-generation college students and first-generation American students, as well as an important symbolic institution for Black communities nationally. Medgar Evers, as a leader, deserves a college that represents the legacy he has left us. Resources and support must be mobilized immediately in support of Medgar Evers College. Our association supports the ongoing movement for Black lives. That movement is the descendant of the abolitionist and civil rights movements, and it demands recognition of the simple fact that Black lives matter. Black lives matter everywhere. They matter on our streets, and they matter in the workplace. Black lives matter at CUNY. As we approach this historic election, we encourage all people to vote with the futures of our students and our city in mind. It is important for everyone in the CUNY community, including our union, to recognize that the workers that CUNY represents are a diverse community, and it is this extraordinary and beautiful diversity that makes our university and our country great.
On behalf of the Association of CUNY Black Faculty and Staff, we stand with you in the struggle for a just society. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Andres Cerpa, and I am an adjunct associate professor at the College of Staten Island. And today, I lost my health insurance. I've worked at the College of Staten Island since the fall of 2015 and been a full-time employee with health insurance for 9 consecutive semesters, 5 years. And in those 5 years, I have joyfully seen a generation of students move from a remediation program like CUNY START, where I was a lecturer in reading and writing, to creative writing courses at the 400 level. I've celebrated with my students as they gained entrance into master's programs in literature, in education, in creative writing, and other studies. Now, this semester will be my first as an adjunct professor. And though I've taught hundreds of students, because of a technicality in our contract's language, none of my 5 years of service count toward a continuation of health insurance. Now, this means that after about a 40% pay cut at CUNY, when jobs are scarce and unemployment is on the rise, I will have to pay $800 a month to make sure that I have sufficient health coverage to meet my needs. I know how important health insurance is. My father died of Parkinson's disease, and every day before his death, he worried that the high cost of keeping him alive would drive my family into bankruptcy. Health insurance is important every day, but to lose it after years of service during a global pandemic, when it costs so much, is frankly inhumane and shows how little CUNY Central cares about me and other faculty and staff that are in similar positions. At this time, I want to earnestly thank my department chair, my dean, and the president's office of the College of Staten Island, because together they have seen my contribution, and this month filed 2 petitions to CUNY Central to continue my health coverage. And CUNY Central unbendingly said no. Now, this is my individual story, but more importantly, I want to say that any cuts to faculty are cuts to student services, and this needs to be recognized. The reality is that adjunct professors teach the majority of courses at CUNY. Faculty interact and build relationships with students as much or more than any other cohort at CUNY. We see our students, we talk to them constantly, whether that be in Zoom, by email, or previously in our classrooms or crumbling hallways. Faculty are the first people at the university to notice when students are in need. We help them and direct them towards services when they are facing food insecurity, housing insecurity. We are role models. We help them plan for their futures. We are there when they are dealing with depression and anxiety. Students don't go to the counseling center without us. They do not respond to generic emails about student service or the college's condolences. Their professors, the majority of whom are underpaid, overworked, and struggling mightily through this pandemic, are the ones that notice their needs, reach out, and direct them to the available resources they need to stay alive and continue their education. I am angry that CUNY Central is turning its back on me. I'm scared that I have to pay $800 a month for health coverage. But more than anything, I am afraid that CUNY Central's and the government's dramatic cuts to our campuses and communities means that they are giving up on New York, they are giving up on our Black and brown students, and they are selling a dream of a more equitable world that is built upon an inequitable, predatory, and frankly inhumane power structure. In this moment, CUNY should be standing up for its students and contingent faculty. It should be honoring its mission, which promises equal access and opportunity for students, faculty, and staff. It's easy to sell that dream, but it's honorable and it's just to live up to our mission in times of difficulty. And what more important than right now?
Hi, I'm Thomas Cleary, librarian at LaGuardia Community College, and as part of today's Around the Clock online action, I'll be sharing some student reflections about their experiences being a student during the pandemic. As you may know, like community colleges in CUNY were initially set up to address the immediate needs of the boroughs they're set up in. And our current students are still no exception to this, and their reflections here make some of these issues really clear. About student reflections, these are excerpts taken from some longer reflections written for a social sciences course at LaGuardia Community College. They're donated to the LaGuardia Community College Institutional Archives as part of our COVID-19 story project. The reflections speak to what students at LaGuardia are experiencing during the pandemic, and they bring up and point out the issues like income disparity, digital divide. They also point out how some of the students are not able to live within, they don't live within their own bubbles and are unable to. But they are integral parts in supporting their families, being involved in their neighborhoods, and also being part of New York City as a whole. So the first topic that comes up a bunch is online learners. So our students are online learners, sometimes for the first time. They reflect on the shift towards online courses. Many find the shift to be more difficult than they expected, and others are faced with the reality of the digital divide. Students have been made anonymous, so they'll be named student number 1, 2, 3, and so forth. So this is a reflection from student number 12. The outbreak of COVID-19 initially stressed me out about the online transition of classes. I do not do well with online works, and I was nervous with how the semester would end up being. As this outbreak started to grow on a large scale, so did my stress. So, student number 21. Many people were excited to go to online classes thinking it was going to be easier, but now we see how stressed everyone is, including me. This is a tough time for everyone. Juggling from work around the house and schoolwork, plus all distractions from living with 10 plus people, is really hard to stay focused and motivated. I was really excited for this school, and I was getting good grades up until we got to online school, which stresses me. It's just a different feeling overall. We have student number 9. Distance learning was tough at first, so I made a plan. The first weeks I shared a computer with my daughter until the Department of Education sent her an iPad. I encouraged my daughter to follow her online schedule. Then I make sure she finishes her work. With my son, it is a little easier. His teacher sends me a weekly bulletin, and I post pictures of him doing what she says on the website. In my case, I have 3 online classes, and all of them with a lot of material to read and assignments to do. Many, if not the majority of our students work while attending classes. Since many of them come from working class families, students and their family members have been designated as essential employees and have been working throughout the pandemic. So a reflection from student number 6. Although at times I'm worried about catching anything, as my mom and I are both essential workers and we're dealing with COVID patients, I try not to live in fear, but rather in caution, as I feel like living in fear will make me stagger and that have me more susceptible to getting sick. Student number 14. The outbreak of COVID-19 has affected me in more ways than I thought it would. Working as a full-time RN and also being a full-time student at the same time, I never really had much time to myself. However, I could not continue my work. You see, I don't have my family in New York, so I share my apartment with a family. The wife is pregnant with her second child, and their kid and I are fond of each other. She told me that going to work amidst COVID-19 pandemic caused her to worry about the family's safety. Since her due date for delivery is due this month, she asked me if I could look for another place to stay. So I quit my job and I'm hunting for an affordable apartment. Not a single day passes where I don't stress out about it. Reflection of student number 8. There are different reasons as why I've been stressing about COVID. because of the fact my dad is an ICU nurse and is going through a stressful time. I know a lot of information about COVID since my dad explains everything to me. He works surrounded by COVID patients every day, and it stresses me out because my dad is exposed to COVID 8 to 16 hours a day. I don't see my dad anymore because of the situation. I see him through my window, but that's about it. Family life. In community colleges, our students do not necessarily fall within the stereotypical idea of what a college student is. Our students tend to be older. Sometimes they are parents themselves. Others are heavily involved in supporting their family's income or also heavily involved with regular household duties. Student number 2. The most stressful thing for me is not being able to be alone. It is like having a lot of time, but at the same time having nothing. I am like the head of my family. I mean, I do everything. Sad face emoji. Student number 9 again. The idea of getting sick or my children or husband was and still is very scary. The transition of being able to walk freely and having to stay inside was a lot to take in, especially because I have 2 preschool-age children who are too young to know what is happening and could not understand why the park is closed. And student number 10. My mom started getting sick and she felt weak or felt like she was going to fall over when doing her daily activities. It gotten so bad that I had to take over. So I started to work part-time, have full-time classes, and take over home. Clean, cook, take care of my mom. Then my worst fears came. My dad started getting sick. He tested positive for COVID-19. At this point, I was at my breaking point. I was lost, and I cried a lot. I didn't know what to do, and I felt like my world was falling apart. And along with those particular stressors, our students are also stressed for a variety of other reasons. They are doing the same things as all CUNY students are dealing with, and everyone is dealing with exceptional amounts of stress as well. The usual support structures are either gone or upended or not in full support currently. And as a few of the other reflections have already noted, and during this crisis, a lot of these students really need additional support from the college, from faculty and staff, and from the lack of and are unable to receive that due to lack of funding. So we have reflection of student number 7. My biggest stressor has to be the fact that I live by myself. When this first started, I was worried that I would get the virus and get really sick and no one would be able to help me. My roommate then tested positive, which most likely meant that I have the virus, and that terrified me to the point of having an anxiety attack because I thought my body wouldn't be able to survive this virus. Student number 16. As a student, I think it's inevitable to think about financial situation because most businesses are closed down and there's less opportunities to work, but basically try to live off your savings. Since I am an international student, I don't qualify for any federal grants or funds, thus it can be stressful. And student number 19. I'm transferring next year to Queens College, and I'm having problems with my registration. The college says that due to the pandemic, things are not running as they usually do, and they're hoping that by the end of May, everything would be resolved. And I understand that it's not their fault. Although I still worry because by this time, I would have already known my schedule, or at least know what classes I have to take. I know that there's nothing I can do about it, but to wait and hope that everything will be fine.
Hi, my name is Matt Brim. I'm professor of queer studies at the College of Staten Island, CUNY, and I'm here as a member of the PSC CUNY Union to talk to you about an op-ed that I wrote and that was published in the Gotham Gazette this past spring. And I wrote this op-ed at a time when coronavirus was hitting New York really hard, and CUNY had to, our classes had to go online to protect our students, faculty, and staff. And in this op-ed, I wanted to make some connections between the health crisis that was new to New York, the novel coronavirus, and the educational crisis that is not at all new to CUNY. And so the title of the op-ed that I wrote is Not a Novel Crisis at CUNY. And you can find it in the Gotham Gazette. It was published on May 6th, 2020. And the thing that I wanted to think about is what an educational crisis looks like in a plague year. And so, in other words, the health crisis was a matter of, and is a matter of life and death. And higher education, while very important, is not a matter of life and death. And so the problems that CUNY has may seem diminished or smaller when compared to and in the moment of the coronavirus. But in fact, I think this is a time when we can think of CUNY, the public health system, or the public education system in New York, and the public health system in New York as reflected in how we handle COVID. It's a moment when we can think of those two things together. Because public education and public health are mirrors of each other in New York City. They're both fighting for the same tax dollars, and they're both overwhelmed and under-resourced, and they're mirrors of each other. They reflect similar problems, especially problems with funding and problems with funding the public good. So in thinking about the coronavirus as a mirror in which we could see reflected other problems in the public realm, such as CUNY and higher education, I realized that what the coronavirus shows us about CUNY is that, yes, when we went online, the state rushed in to buy our poor and working class and working poor and middle class CUNY students. The state sort of rushed in to buy them technology, computers, so that they could go online while learning from home. But our students needed that technology before coronavirus, right? So much learning happens online. We request that our students type their papers. So much research has to happen online. So it's not just a crisis for our students once people start getting sick. They've had an educational crisis for a long time now, but where was the state of New York before coronavirus, helping them with their technological needs? Before COVID, if you look at CUNY's campuses, we didn't have printer paper. Our libraries didn't have money to buy books. And in less than half of the classrooms would you find tenure-track faculty, the people who are most prepared and most compensated for teaching CUNY students. And yet we appear in only half of the classrooms. We see in the mirror of the coronavirus the state of New York being unprepared, not only for an unimaginable health emergency, so we were unprepared with personal protective equipment and ventilators, but at the same time we see CUNY having exposed its own long-standing safety issues. So at my college we haven't had hot water in the restrooms for years. If you look around social media at CUNY, you will see students at Brooklyn College or Queens College posting about black mold on their campuses, or open elevator shafts, or vermin in the halls of CUNY. So just as we needed short-term healthcare heroics to help fight the coronavirus, we also see right now that we need long-term healthcare heroics to keep our students and our faculty and our staff at CUNY safe. In other words, CUNY has a healthcare issue that predates coronavirus. In the mirror of the virus, we see with fresh eyes that the state of New York has for decades refused to properly fund the MTA. And the MTA is the primary source of transit for CUNY students, our citywide commuters, and that includes faculty and staff as well. We saw what MTA did, or what COVID did to ridership on the MTA. And we saw the sort of ghost ship that was the MTA in more affluent neighborhoods. But we saw that the subways became almost human petri dishes in poor neighborhoods. And so there was very much a healthcare issue on the MTA. But the MTA also relates to CUNY's problems because it's the form of transit that our students use most. For years, the MTA has dilapidated trains and slow buses, and that deeply underfunded transportation system has directly resulted in late students to CUNY classes, missed classes, lower grades, and unconscionably high dropout rates. If we think back a few years, we remember New York's most deadly plague, AIDS, which continues to be a deadly plague for poor Black women, poor women of color, poor Black men, Hispanic men, men who have sex with men, drug users who don't have proper needle exchange, and generally the most despised in New York City, the homeless. Well, the COVID-19 reminds us of AIDS in that during the COVID-19 pandemic, we also see the state punishing its most despised, its poorest, the homeless. But the state is also punishing CUNY students. These are our low-income students, our precarious dreamers, our working class students with no margin for error. Whatever the price New York City ends up paying for COVID-19, we know that it will be paid first and foremost by our Black and brown and ethnic white CUNY students. Just as we see COVID-19 hit their communities the hardest, right? We also know that those are CUNY communities. And so CUNY students get hit the hardest. What the coronavirus brings into startling clarity is that we need to stop using the same threadbare language that we've long used to cast CUNY's failures as its strengths. Aspiration in the face of massive defunding, social mobility for the minority of CUNY students who graduate, and our democratizing mission despite constant tuition increases and the ever-widening disparities between CUNY and funded schools. So we can ask, what will happen to CUNY after COVID-19? Well, we can have dire predictions about what will happen to the university, or we can have a kind of revolutionary hope about what we want to happen to the university. But I think the truth is that we just have to confront this mundane, deeply structural crisis that defines CUNY and public education. And the very least we can do right now is admit that in the many years of short-sighted austerity budgeting since the 2008 recession, CUNY has actually managed to become less rather than more prepared to meet the current moment, the current COVID moment, and the current educational moment. So, Governor Cuomo, you must use the timing of COVID to set a new timeline for CUNY, this related public system. Before the urgency of the health crisis ends, let tuition at CUNY end. CUNY used to be free. Let's zero out tuition once again. Let's forgive tuition for CUNY students with student loan debt, and let's erase tuition going forward at CUNY. Before COVID-19 kills more of our faculty and our staff, let's let CUNY commit to doubling its full-time faculty. Let's have CUNY commit to adding more staff to student services like advising. Let's have CUNY provide our well-qualified adjuncts clear routes to the new tenure track jobs that we need to be creating right now to build the future for CUNY. Before COVID-19 becomes a normalized health disaster, let's disrupt New York's educational disaster by, if we have to, calling it by that name. For as CUNY's 275,000 students and 45,000 instructional faculty and staff know, our crisis at CUNY is anything but novel. I thank you so much for listening today, and I really encourage you, if some of what I said made sense, to contact your local representatives, to contact your state representatives, and especially to contact Governor Cuomo to tell him that he has to fund CUNY with the kind of dedication that the students have to the system. We need to see that out of him as well. Thank you very much for listening.
The City University of New York plans to lay off thousands of adjunct faculty and part-time workers and cut thousands of classes. Hurting CUNY means hurting our recovery. CUNY has lifted generations of New Yorkers out of poverty and serves communities hardest hit by this crisis. Essential workers and their families rely on CUNY. And cutting faculty means students may not graduate. Tell CUNY not to turn its back on our city's most vulnerable communities during this crisis. We are in a moment of reckoning. Black and brown New Yorkers have been disproportionately affected by COVID and targeted by racist violence. And in this moment when New York should be investing more in institutions that serve communities of color, the City University of New York plans to cut thousands of classes and lay off thousands of adjunct faculty and part-time workers. CUNY must do better. Don't fail New Yorkers in this crisis.
Hello, I'm Sharon Persinger, the PSC Treasurer. I want to talk to you about numbers and money. I'm asking you to do your part to ensure that the communities of New York get the federal resources they need. I'm asking you to complete the census. You can complete the census online, by phone, by mail if you still have the survey. It's easy, and it takes less than 10 minutes. So what does the census have to do with money? More than 130 federal programs distribute a combined $1.5 trillion based on the population counts from the census. Funding for K-12 education, school lunches, hospitals and other medical assistance, highways, public transit, Pell Grants, housing, so much more is determined with census data. Basically, the more New Yorkers are counted in the census, the more funding New York receives. By completing the census, you'll also be helping to ensure that New York gets the maximum possible representation in Congress. If many New Yorkers are not counted, New York could lose a seat in the House of Representatives. Even in the very best of times, many New Yorkers go uncounted in the census. People of color, immigrants, the poor, the people that CUNY exists to serve are typically undercounted. And of course, these are not the best of times. The door-to-door survey, which is critical for collecting data on these undercounted groups, is being conducted now and goes until September 30th. If you complete the census on your own, you make the job of these census enumerators much easier. So please, fill out the census online, or by phone, or by mail. Encourage your students, your friends, your family, your neighbors to do the same. There's the information. Be counted. Help New York to get the funding it needs and deserves for safety net programs, for infrastructure, for education, and more. Fill out the census.
Yo, the census mean dollars and cents for us. More programming gets funded, more stops in the local bus. The community needs need to be communicated. Be counted, your silence won't get you any consideration. 10,000 people like they never listened to us. Those same 10,000 never gave the census a touch. Didn't give it a glance, didn't give it a chance. And get mad at legislators for not meeting their demands. Demands they never made, demands they never gave. Concerns that might as well be shadows in the shade. A party of one will never get a parade. In numbers there's power, be counted, make a change. You need hospitals, let them know. Schools, let them know. Higher education and roads, let them know. The census shaped the next 10 years of our life. On a national, local level, let's help them get it right. Let them know, 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 let them know. This is our opportunity to push the narrative and help write our story. The story of America. What is America? Who's here? How are we living? What do we make? What are our challenges? What do we need? Let them know.
Let me begin by wishing everybody a happy and successful new academic year and keep up the good fight. This presentation is based on an article I did for The Independent back in April. And it's focused on the curious use of the term social distancing as a synonym for physical distancing. Social distancing suggests the loosening of social ties, when in fact the pleas that authorities and public health officials make on behalf of physical distancing clearly appeal to feelings of social solidarity, which of course are increasingly scarce in competitive and individualistic capitalist societies. Hence, for example, lots of people think that being required to physically distance is an affront on their freedom. So using the term social distancing to designate a public health strategy that seeks to combat pandemics ironically vilifies the very social solidarity necessary if people are to sacrifice for the good of the broader community and the most vulnerable to the disease, the habits on which their economic survival and general sense of well-being depend. Treating the social distancing and physical distancing as synonyms is especially misleading given their very different relationships to the capitalist economic system in which we live. Capitalism has historically abolished physical distancing through its concentration of the population in large urban centers, as well as through the technologies of transportation and communications that bring distant parts of the world together and that power the processes of globalization. This process of globalization and urbanization vastly increase the likelihood of global pandemics and also the potentially catastrophic impact of such pandemics. And this is compounded by capitalism's industrialization of food production and the displacement of small farmers by large agribusiness corporations in different parts of the world. This further fuels capitalism's abolition of physical distancing in two ways. First, by pushing ruined farmers to overcrowded urban slums in the global south, which lack basic infrastructure such as running water, thus making it very hard for people to observe physical distancing. And secondly, these processes push other small farmers to marginal lands at the edge of wild forests, where they're more likely to come into contact with wild animals carrying viruses that can potentially trigger lethal pandemics. On the other hand, just as capitalism abolishes physical distancing, it increases social distancing by undercutting the social solidarity that the authorities now evoke when they plead with the public to observe physical distancing. Capitalism undercuts social solidarity in a number of ways. First, its exploitative class nature understandably leads to social and class conflict, while encouraging capitalist elites to treat their workers as well as the consumers as only a means to the pursuit of profit. This instrumentalization of other human beings is, of course, not the product of individual capitalists being bad people, but it is the structural product of the competitive economic pressures that even capitalists are subject to. Secondly, capitalism's transformation of labor power into a commodity bought and sold in labor markets tends to divide workers, who find themselves competing against each other for jobs that are often scarce. This competition makes it harder for them to unite in an effort to replace capitalism with an alternative socioeconomic order that would be less inimical to social solidarity and the development and well-being of all human beings. Third, capital's obvious benefits from divisions within the ranks of working people have historically encouraged capitalist elites to perpetuate discriminatory practices that reproduce racial, ethnic, gender, religious, and other cleavages, social cleavages among workers. And such discriminatory practices, of course, only form part of the broader structural racism which accounts for the disproportionate impact of the current pandemic on African Americans. So if capitalism's abolition of physical distancing increases the likelihood of global pandemics, its erosion of social solidarity magnifies their catastrophic impact. Let me conclude with a recent example that illustrates the difference between physical and social distancing. This has to do with the recent incident of Amazon trying to capitalize on the pandemic by making their workers labor in hazardous conditions. And when labor activists try to organize workers against this situation, against basically public working conditions that endanger the health of workers because they didn't really follow the public health protocols that correspond to the concept of physical distancing, Amazon fired the activists who were trying to organize workers through walkouts and so on and so forth. And to add insult to injury, it was Amazon that claimed that the reason they fired the activists was because they were not following Amazon's physical distancing policies. So what you have here is you have a corporate giant not respecting the need for physical distancing as public health strategy, endangering as a result workers' health, and then responding to workers' protests in a way that, first of all, illustrates capitalism's exploitative nature and its propensity towards social distancing. But even more, Amazon, in effect, tried to turn even physical distancing into a weapon against workers, into a means of exploitation, and into a means of basically perpetuating capitalism's agenda of social distancing, of promoting class exploitation. All in all, although physical distancing is indeed a crucial public health measure during pandemics, the social distancing that capitalism systematically generates is a threat to human well-being, no less grave than the virus currently haunting our, daily lives. Thank you, and once again, have a good new academic year.
Hello, my name is Ángeles Donoso Macaya. I teach Latin American literature and Spanish in the Modern Languages Department at BMCC. I'm an associate professor, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about this committee that we formed at BMCC, a strike authorization vote committee. A few months ago, we started meeting to do phone banking, to call our colleagues, our adjunct colleagues and full-time colleagues to learn more about their experiences during the pandemic. As we all know, the administration has imposed many different changes, and we have been our labor completely transformed in the past few months. And the only way to learn what our colleagues and the union members are experiencing right now is talking, right? So we have been meeting once a week, sometimes more, sometimes less, and we have been calling our colleagues to learn about their experiences during this time. We believe that the situation is unbearable right now and that we need to organize, and that's why we formed this committee. We think that phone banking is a great organizational tool, and it's the best way to learn what the members actually think and feel. And it's a good opportunity to talk about, what kind of actions we all as a collective can do. So now I'm gonna leave you with my colleague David, who's gonna talk a little bit more about this.
Hi, my name is David Clausen. I teach Latin American history in the Center for Ethnic Studies at BMCC. And I'm just gonna talk a little bit about my experience phone banking. I think when I first started phone banking, I thought that it would be really intimidating, that, I would have to feel like I was like telemarketing someone who was uninterested. But my experience of actually calling people has been completely different from that, actually. Because when I talk to people and I remind them or tell them for the first time that 2,800 people have been laid off, which is like fully a fifth of adjuncts in CUNY. And when I talk about some of the other sort of major changes that have either happened or that the administration is threatening to do in the future, to cut programs, to cut all sorts of stuff, people are really angry and people are really willing to talk and to discuss it on the phone. And people are happy to have someone to listen to what problems they've been having. They're really excited to talk about how we can collectively respond to these sorts of attacks on their colleagues and their comrades. And it's actually really, really encouraging and enlivening to sort of know that there are other people out there who think the same way and are also willing to fight back. So actually phone banking has been really, rather than being intimidating or demobilizing, has actually been exactly the opposite. And I'll pass on to Boyda.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Boyda Johnstone. I'm an assistant professor in the English department at BMCC. And I partly wanted to just echo what Angeles and David have been saying about how phone banking right now, during this time when we've all been locked in our homes for months and we've had to deal with these distance learning requirements that have suddenly been foisted upon us, phone banking during this socially distanced time is one way that we can connect with one another and collect our stories. So phone banking can help us compare what's happening between departments and between different campuses as we all learn to talk to one another and have these conversations. And as we realize that actually what's happening is very uneven between different departments and different campuses, which is really important. I'll just share as well that in the English department, we've just learned this week that our classes have been raised, course caps have been raised for us by 3 students per class, which happened with no notification from the administration. It just suddenly people have logged into CUNY First and realizes that their classes are now at 29 when a few days ago they were at 26. And so this was something that the administration did behind closed doors to save money. And in response to that, we've been meeting, we've been talking to one another and meeting within the English department and trying to formulate some kind of organized strategy to fight this. So I think, and these things wouldn't be happening if we weren't talking to one another. We wouldn't realize that our struggles are shared. So like David said, like I've been calling a lot of adjuncts in my department, and we've been learning how to deal with so much of what the summer has forced us to work through. I think we've had, in the English department, we all had to build our classes online before getting them approved for the fall. And I know that has caused a lot of consternation for adjuncts who don't have those classes yet. Some have put in, literally hundreds of hours building online courses that they're not even guaranteed. So it has just been like a shared story. Every single conversation I have has been expressing, some frustration around this. And in talking to these people, not only can I talk about the importance of striking right now as a viable tactic that the PSC needs to seriously be considering. But also I can help these adjuncts. I can say like, okay, here's the thing, shoot me an email, I can help you build this part of your class. We can work together to help meet these requirements that you have to make in order to get jobs right now during this time. So I think, I'll pass it along then to Dan.
Thank you. So my name is Dan Swanson, and I'm an adjunct professor in the mechanical engineering department at CUNY City Tech. And I've been active with the union since 2017. And we've been very helpful for keeping our wages higher, and also for trying to represent all of the different people in the union. And the teachers union is something that you don't get with other jobs, and it's something that when you're working with them, you feel a sense of empowerment, and you feel like you're part of the solution and not the problem. And you don't always feel that way in every job that you have. So to come and phone bank and to help with that, that's a good feeling. And then also when you sign anything and you agree to the things that they're asking in the PSC union, then you're also feeling good because you feel like you're contributing to the solution. And this is something that, for me, I've definitely enjoyed being a part of the union while at CUNY, and I'm still employed at CUNY. I'm not one of the 3,000 adjuncts that were let go, but between the lack of work and the oversized classes that are a result of all those adjuncts being let go, I may be just retiring myself at an early age. So this is something that it's just not right. And when you're talking about defunding things, we shouldn't be the top thing in the state that is defunded. Education is one of the most important parts of a community. And when we're talking about other parts, such as funding the police and other community organizations, those things can get a little bit less funding. They don't need all the funding that they're getting. And we should definitely not be the first thing that is defunded. I can't stress that enough. Education is what a good society is built on. And we need to continue to put more money and more support into the union. So with that, I'll pass it on to James.
Hi, my name is James Scales. I am an adjunct lecturer in the English department at BMCC. I am very new to a lot of this. I've been, involved a little bit for the last month or so. And I had some uncertainty and some hesitancy in getting involved. Like a lot of you, I had a very stressful, uncertain summer. There was a lot of stress and uncertainty around whether I would be teaching this semester. As of this morning, I have a class. So, I've sort of seen it from both sides, like the fear and then the sort of relief when at least I'll be working. How many students will I have? That's the next question. And I think in both those cases, when you're feeling that uncertainty and you're also feeling that relief, it's also very easy to feel alone in both cases, and to feel like, this is a sort of a struggle that you have to deal with or you have to try to work on your own. And I think, as I've gotten involved, and as others have just said before me, there's a real sense of empowerment and a sense of community that you find here, and that is incredibly vital at this moment. We're here to help each other. This is what we should be doing. And at a moment where we, are struggling to find and coordinate power, this is how it starts. It starts with these kinds of conversations. So if you have been interested in getting involved, or you're worried, or maybe you're relieved because you are teaching a class and now you feel secure, this is the time to get involved and to make sure that we can all sort of help each other out in this situation, whether that's signing the petition or making phone calls. We want to encourage you to join us in phone banking. And I will pass it off to Gustavo.
Okay, thanks, James. Hey, everybody. My name is Gustavo Rivera. I'm an adjunct at the BMCC, at City Tech, and continued education teacher at Kingsborough College, though I definitely haven't heard anything from them in ages. And I think James brings up a good point, and it's this idea of feeling alone. And we're in this culture where a lot of times we do feel that way, and sometimes it's encouraged, I believe, to keep us separated when we don't see the reality that together we could have something better, right? And so that's why I encourage you to get involved with phone banking, or outreaching to your union members in any way possible. Recently, the PSC lost its court case against early non-reappointments that CUNY administration has done, which has already been mentioned. And this sets an awful precedent for the future of organized labor. We need to get leverage back. And if not, we will continue to be at the whims of administration. The only way to get leverage in this case, and it should have been done ages ago. We should have never done that contract and gone on strike, but if not, then let's do this now. To be able to withhold our labor and to be able to go on the streets, because if not, we will be left hanging. So I encourage you to get involved at the BMCC, City Tech, Kingsborough, La Guardia, wherever you can. If your chapter chair isn't already talking about this, please encourage them. Because they need to get involved, because only us working together from the bottom up will we have, the answers we want to see.
Hello, my name is Andres Cerpa, and I'm an adjunct associate professor at the College of Staten Island. And today, I lost my health insurance. I've worked at the College of Staten Island since the fall of 2015 and been a full-time employee with health insurance for 9 consecutive semesters, 5 years. And in those 5 years, I have joyfully seen a generation of students move from a remediation program like CUNY START, where I was a lecturer in reading and writing, to creative writing courses at the 400 level. I've celebrated with my students as they gained entrance into master's programs in literature, in education, in creative writing, and other studies. Now this semester will be my first as an adjunct professor. And though I've taught hundreds of students, because of a technicality in our contract's language, none of my 5 years of service count toward a continuation of health insurance. Now this means that after about a 40% pay cut at CUNY, when jobs are scarce and unemployment is on the rise, I will have to pay $800 a month to make sure that I have sufficient health coverage to meet my needs. I know how important health insurance is. My father died of Parkinson's disease, and every day before his death, he worried that the high cost of keeping him alive would drive my family into bankruptcy. Health insurance is important every day, but to lose it after years of service during a global pandemic, when it costs so much, is frankly inhumane and shows how little CUNY Central cares about me and other faculty and staff that are in similar positions. At this time, I want to earnestly thank my department chair, my dean, and the president's office of the College of Staten Island, because together they have seen my contribution and this month filed 2 petitions to CUNY Central to continue my health coverage. And CUNY Central unbendingly said no. Now this is my individual story, but more importantly, I want to say that any cuts to faculty are cuts to student services, and this needs to be recognized. The reality is that adjunct professors teach the majority of courses at CUNY. Faculty interact and build relationships with students as much or more than any other cohort at CUNY. We see our students, we talk to them constantly, whether that be in Zoom, by email, or previously in our classrooms or crumbling hallways. Faculty are the first people at the university to notice when students are in need. We help them and direct them towards services when they are facing food insecurity, housing insecurity. We are role models. We help them plan for their futures. We are there when they are dealing with depression and anxiety. Students don't go to the counseling center without us. They do not respond to generic emails about student service or the college's condolences. Their professors, the majority of whom are underpaid, overworked, and struggling mightily through this pandemic, are the ones that notice their needs, reach out, and direct them to the available resources they need to stay alive and continue their education. I am angry that CUNY Central is turning its back on me. I'm scared that I have to pay $800 a month for health coverage. But more than anything, I am afraid that CUNY Central's and the government's dramatic cuts to our campuses and communities means that they are giving up on New York, they are giving up on our Black and brown students, and they are selling a dream of a more equitable world that is built upon an inequitable, predatory, and frankly inhumane power structure. In this moment, CUNY should be standing up for its students and contingent faculty. It should be honoring its mission, which promises equal access and opportunity for students, faculty, and staff. It's easy to sell that dream, but it's honorable and it's just to live up to our mission in times of difficulty. And what more important than right now?
So this has been an amazing day, and George will be taking you through the rest of the night into the morning. I hope that you noted down places during this 24 hours to direct your students to and ideas to bring into your classroom. We also want members to sign a public pledge. Our goal is for 5,000 PSC members to sign the pledge by the time this ends, which is 7:59 a.m. on August 27th. And the link is on the site. Sign it, ask other members to join you in signing it. Other things you can do is you can sign up to Phone Bank and speak to your colleagues about what they're thinking and what they're ready to do. Write to the chancellor, write to the governor. Let's fight for the future of our university. The people united will never be defeated. I also wanted to thank everyone who worked together to organize this, especially James, George, Penny, Naomi, and Fran, who turned this idea into something tangible. All of the PSC officers and staff and the exec who hosted or sat in on multiple sessions today, even on this day, which is the first day of classes on most campuses, and at Guttman, it's our first day of summer bridge. I hope you've learned as much as I have, and I hope if you're still up, you'll continue with us. Coming up next will be Mike Fabricant and Steve Brier and their op-ed on racialized austerity, save lives, save jobs, save CUNY. Good luck, George.
Okay. Hi, welcome. I'm Steve Brier, faculty member at the CUNY Graduate Center in Urban Education. And Mike, why don't you introduce?
I'm Mike Fabricant, faculty member at Hunter College at Silberman School of Social Work.
Mike and I have just published an article on racialized austerity at CUNY in the current issue of the Gotham Gazette. And we thought it might be interesting to have a kind of conversation between the two of us about some of the larger underlying questions that we raise in the article as a way to kind of motivate people to think about those big questions in this incredibly difficult moment that we're facing, both within CUNY and the larger society. So Mike, let me pose the first question to you. We use the term racialized austerity. What does that mean, and how has it affected the quality of education at CUNY?
Well, I mean, I want to start with CUNY itself as a case example, and then sort of stretch out briefly to sort of national trends. At CUNY, what racialized austerity means is that we have a university that has gone from almost no Black and brown students back in the late 60s, early 70s, primarily white, to a process of open admissions, an experience of open admissions, which transformed the composition of the student body to over 70% Black and brown students. Now, they're not only 70% Black and brown students, we also have about 60% whose family incomes are under $30,000, which we'll speak about later. So when we look at the history of CUNY, what we see is before open admissions, or the transformation really of the student body, it was a largely middle-class white student body with 11,500 full-time faculty, approximately, and there was no tuition cost, it was free. And the consequence of all of that was that it made it a different kind of experience, having full-time faculty on the one hand who had the opportunity to be with students and meet with students in ways that part-time faculty, for example, presently would like to, but often can't because they're running from class to class in order to try to cobble together a living. Tuition, and having no tuition, meant that students didn't have to be concerned. And it wasn't only tuition, books were free as well. There were no fees. So it made for a different kind of access and quality. But post the open admissions, what we begin to see over a 40-year period is the diminishment of funding for CUNY over the last 15 to 20 years, adjusted for inflation. In senior colleges, the state has diminished its investment in CUNY by 21% for full-time equivalent students. And that is not discussed. That is the joining of austerity to the changed composition of the university is really not discussed. How race converges with this diminishment of resources, with this diminishment of quality. And since folks who've been in the university have only been here, say, for 4 or 5 years, 6, 7 years, they have no historic memory of what was. They have a memory only of what has existed in that 5 or 6 year period. And the consequence is there is a kind of austerity that's been really a chokehold that's tightening on the university that has resulted in a diminished quality of education, which we'll talk about later. But it's happening in good economic times, that is the diminishment of resources, and bad economic times, good and bad. And it is disproportionately and substantially at CUNY affecting the opportunities for Black and brown students to build their lives. All of this happens within a context in which empirically we know CUNY does a better job moving students from poverty into the middle class, again, largely Black and brown students, than all of the Ivy League, MIT, and California Institute of Technology. So the record of CUNY is clear, but the investment or the disinvestment continues to occur. And in my estimation, it's that convergence, it's that compelling association that's racialized austerity. And, you know, nationally, what we've seen is a parallel. California has a parallel experience, not the same, but a parallel of disinvestment. And frankly, we've seen an influx of Black and brown students looking for mobility. At the same time, across the country, we've seen the most dramatic declines in investment in public higher education. And not only looking for mobility, looking for the kind of transformation academically in mobility that public higher education brings to people's lives.
Right.
So I'd ask you, Steve, you know, because we alluded to earlier, is how does class enter into this conversation about racialized austerity? Is there a critical relationship between, for example, class, race, and austerity, and what might it be?
Well, I think, you know, to understand the relationship, you know, of class and its, you know, importance within this context, I think we need to go back and sketch a little bit more of the history of CUNY. And it seems to me that, you know, CUNY had a reputation before it was even CUNY, when it was just the municipal colleges. Remember, CUNY is founded in 1961. And in effect, before then, there are 4 senior colleges. They're known as the municipal colleges, and they were talked about as essentially the Harvard of the proletariat, except I think what was rarely discussed is that proletariat was overwhelmingly white. It was sort of white, striving New Yorkers who wanted to come to get a quality higher education within a municipal system that was tuition free. So in effect, CUNY, before it was even CUNY, remember it's founded in 61, and even after its founding and there's a commitment to expand it, the institution remains overwhelmingly white, as you indicated in your opening comments. And so I think we need to understand there's an intersection, if you will, of class and race within the CUNY situation and probably nationally across the country. You can't talk about race without talking about class and vice versa. And so I think your point just now about how important CUNY as a contemporary institution is in raising the prospects of our poor and working class students to achieve some kind of, you know, working class, upper working class, or middle class status, as we like to say now, not my favorite term, but we use it for the sake of this project, is fundamental. And yet, as you also suggested, the problem is that the state has disinvested, not so much around issues of class, but also around issues of race. And I think we can't understand what's happening in CUNY in the last 10 years, in the last 20 years, or even the last 30 years without understanding the intersection of race and class within that context. And I guess the other point I would make about, you know, how CUNY gets funded is it's important to remember that the so-called fiscal crisis of the mid-1970s, which ended free tuition, which was an incredibly important thing for 130 years of CUNY's history, municipal college's history, going back to the founding of what became City College in 1847. It's not accidental or incidental that 5 years after open admissions happened, when the doors of the university were thrown open to a much more diverse, we became a model for what diversity in public higher education would look like. CUNY did in the early 70s, and we did it with lots of problems and lots of difficulties, but we did it and fundamentally transformed the ethnic and racial composition of the CUNY student body. It's not accidental that 5 years later, when the fiscal crisis happens, the first thing to go is free tuition. So the irony is Black and brown New Yorkers get the benefit of what white New Yorkers had for 130 years. They get the benefit of free tuition for 5 years. And let's be clear, the struggle for open admissions was not just a struggle for opening the doors of CUNY and keeping tuition free. The thing we argue in our book, Austerity Blues, is an important thing for us to remember. We, meaning CUNY, was at the forefront in the transformation of curricula of the public university, which spilled over into the privates. We get Black studies, we get Puerto Rican studies, we get women's studies, we get gay and lesbian studies, all in a relatively short period, in part because of the mobilization of students of color and their white allies to fight not just for free tuition and open admissions, but a broadening of the curriculum for Black history and a range of other things that are now back on the agenda now. So that's the historical context, and class plays a key role, but it can't be perceived as the only role. Maybe we could talk now, Mike, a little bit, about this idea of free tuition, since it's sort of, we put it on the table. Can you sort of say a little bit about your thoughts about whether the return of free tuition would solve the problems of racialized austerity?
It's a necessary but not sufficient huge step forward. If we can begin to talk about and invoke free tuition, and we have to acknowledge that New York State has a system of tuition assistance program which covers large parts of the tuition for many students, particularly poor students. But that said, it's not free tuition for the students coming in as much as many students coming to CUNY do pay tuition. And so what we're looking at is not necessarily a tuition assistance program as much as we are a reinstitution of access in a relationship to free tuition rather than a grant that subsidizes all or part of the tuition. So would it solve it? An absolutely necessary step, and yet again, New York could, in this instance, as it did in the 60s and the 50s and the 40s, but in this moment for largely Black and brown students, take the lead nationally and say, in this moment of crisis, it's extraordinarily important for students, especially poor students, especially students of color, to have access to public higher education for the many reasons we've cited. And we are going to declare free tuition, and the state will subsidize that through public investment and be a kind of beacon for the rest of the nation. But that said, the disinvestment that's occurred has occurred in the operational side of the university. And what does that mean? It's the state's investment in full-time faculty as contrasted to a cheapened, exploited investment in part-time faculty, in its capital budget, in mental health services and advising. And so what we have is a university, as I alluded to earlier, as we've both spoken to, that in the 50s and 60s, and I gave a specific number, between 11,500 full-time faculty members. Now it's down to 7,400. That has a consequence in terms of what folks can bring to students, particularly outside the classroom. A reduced a ratio of mental health counselors to students of 27 to 100 to 1, when the recommended ratio nationally, and it's not a great ratio, but the recommended is almost half that, which is 1,500 to 1. Advising, where students really can't get to their advisors, and it's really, I remember back when I was a student, I met with my advisor as a freshman once every couple of weeks in order to figure out where I was going, what courses I needed, and how to get there. That doesn't happen now with the.
You and I both went to public universities. We weren't in privates. That happened in public universities.
That's exactly right, Steve. So what does all that mean? When the state disinvests in the university in the ways that it has, to begin with, you've got an exploited part-time faculty labor force, underpaid, running around in many ways, not being able to necessarily have the kind of engagement with students outside the classroom. The union has tried to correct that in the last contract negotiation by providing for an additional hour outside the classroom in which part-time faculty are paid to meet with students. But it doesn't fully resolve the issue. And so that's one question. Much of my learning as an undergraduate, as much as I did in the classroom, was outside the classroom. And I think that gets lost in this present period. We have science labs where the test tubes are so inexpensive. That is, the university can't afford the better test tubes. They can't afford the better labs. The test tubes break. We have many students, again, Black and brown students, looking to create careers in science, to applied areas like nursing, medicine. And these are just not acceptable conditions for students attempting to move into health sciences, it's a degraded learning experience. Libraries that are only open, fewer and fewer hours, so that access to library materials, those materials not online, is much more difficult. And I could go on and on. Classrooms that are not able to entertain the number of students assigned to that class, classes that are far too large because the university is cutting back. And all of this is exacerbated by the present moment, the COVID moment, in which we are moving toward online learning, and actually it's not moving toward it, we are online, and the university, as a result of cutbacks, budget and otherwise, in which the state is unwilling to, and the federal government, frankly, is unwilling to make the investment, they are increasing the size of online learning classes by 15 to 25%. That's just the first salvo. Those classes and the experience of students in those classes is greatly dependent upon the size of the class and the pedagogy, because it's so different than in class. And in fact, the ratio, the national standard is 12 to 1, 12 students to 1 faculty. We are now at a point where we're looking at 29 within the university as a standard. It's a serious, serious problem across the board regarding quality. We must have access, necessary, free tuition, but what's sufficient is access and quality.
Yeah, I would say that the other thing to note is we are at the highest enrollment in CUNY than we've been in our history. I mean, it expanded dramatically in the open admissions period to about 250,000 or so. We're at 275 now. I mean, it's hard to know what the COVID crisis is going to do, but it seems to me that we really do need to sort of understand that racialized austerity is going to get exacerbated, made much, much worse in the midst of this COVID crisis. Because what we do know about our students is, we make this middle-class assumption that everybody's doing what we're doing. We're sitting at home with a relatively decent computer, a quiet background, and a relatively decent internet connection, and we can do this kind of thing. Many, many, many of our students who come from poor households, I think the figure is 60 to 70% of our students come from households with less than $30,000 in annual income. They don't have the necessary computer technology. They don't have the internet connection. They don't even have necessarily a quiet place to sit to be able to do what you and I are doing now, which is have a conversation or participate in class. So it seems to me that the COVID crisis has really has and will continue to exacerbate racialized austerity moving forward. And I think it's part of why we need, a kind of program and policy that really argues for the full funding of CUNY. It seems to me in a moment when, in effect, the governor is not interested in entertaining the idea of taxing billionaires, which is one certain thing that we want to talk about in a moment. So I guess the question that I would pose to you as a final thought, can racialized austerity be fixed at CUNY, given that we're still mired in, are there things that we can and should be doing, fighting for really as faculty, as students committed to CUNY, as our union? What can we be doing to sort of fight against racialized austerity in this particular moment?
Yeah, that's the bottom line question. I think it's the fundamental question. And I think the uprisings we've seen on the streets and the rebellion on the streets around police brutality and Black and brown communities is a beginning of really raising the whole question of the differential treatment of Black and brown communities in that instance around police brutality. But we know that it extends beyond the question of policing. And higher education is one of those areas that is most affected by this kind of distribution of resources. So what can we do? I'll start with the fact that things are being done. I mean, there is a new appetite, I think, in Albany for taxing the very wealthy. The governor is completely resistant at the moment to taxing the wealthy and playing a who blinks first game with the federal government about the allocation of federal dollars necessary clearly during this period. But no matter how much money the federal government allocates, it's not going to fully fill the gap for this state. And some part that is the fiscal debt, the fiscal gap for the state, which is estimated to be $15 billion this year. So the state's going to have to step up in some new ways. And I'd say there's historic precedent for that. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt stepped up in the 1930s and basically said, look, public higher education is important. Here we are in the depths of the Depression. I think we're going to build a new college in Brooklyn, and we'll call it Brooklyn College. It was built during the Depression because there was a vision about the role the public higher education plays.
This was when he was governor, right? Not when he was president.
Not when he was president. When he was governor, the analog is complete. When he was governor. So how do we move forward? Well, there are some key elements that we've talked about here. One, we have to address the question of free tuition. We have to address the question of rebuilding the full-time faculty teaching cohort for CUNY from 7,500 back at least to what it was in 1975 of between 11,500, 12,000. We have to bolster our mental health and advising services. We have to rebuild some of the buildings and that are falling apart and build new ones to entertain the many and expanding interests of students. So how do we get from, and we have to increase the wages for part-time faculty who are living on a below subsistence wage level. So how do we get there? Well,
just to add, the one thing I would add, as someone who teaches at the Graduate Center, particularly attuned to what impact this has all had on our graduate students, is we lost 2,800 part-time faculty in the cutbacks, as we talked about. They've got to be a priority for us and for the union to get those people minimally back to where they were. And as I think we try to argue in our piece in the Gotham Gazette, give them access to the hopefully the full-time jobs that we, the increased full-time jobs, because we've seen this reduction. I mean, if you take everything into account, we're 50% lower in teaching staff than we were in 1972, 73.
And the cuts to part-time faculty, as you pointed out, there are 2,800 part-time faculty who are non-reappointed or laid off, which is going to be the driving force for the increase in class size and reduction in quality of education and the increased class size online. So absolutely. But that question is perhaps the most immediate in addition to people being able to come back to work safely in the university. But going forward into a future, those items that I just mentioned, all 5 of those or 6 of those items, are contained in a piece of legislation that we think PSC is going to unveil as a campaign and unveil as legislation in November. We're going to call the New Deal for legislation. It's aspirational in a moment that we think actually it's critically important to be aspirational, what the university needs, not necessarily what the state is evoking in terms of more intensified austerity and why it needs these dollars. Well, what's the proposal going to be? In part, it's going to be tax the wealthy in order to the ultra wealthy to do it. But in fact, and I want to argue this, and I think we make a very compelling argument, that CUNY is one of the most important, if not the most important, economic engines in New York City. Clear, and there's almost, the multiplier in terms of public investment and what's brought back to the city is clear. The mobility for Black and brown students, largely, but not entirely, from poverty into the middle class is clear. The fact that students in New York City, who attend CUNY, stay in New York City as compared to other public higher education institutions, bolstering the multiplier for the city is clear. What is also clear is economic development money that the state spends, which amounts to about $10 billion, a fraction of what we're asking for, about $1 billion to $1.2 billion for CUNY, is often misspent. We see and have heard stories about the economic development money upstate, hundreds of millions of dollars producing 15, 20, 25, 30 jobs. It's, it has been called a boondoggle.
Well, the other prime example in our own realm is, Cuomo's support for the guy who ran the SUNY technology thing, who sort of pissed away $1 billion with nothing to show for it. So exactly. There you go, right there.
Right. And so you're talking about billions of dollars being spent on economic development. Some yield, we're not going to say there isn't any yield, but what we're saying is about 10-12% of that should be rededicated to CUNY in order to enable CUNY to do its critical work, for which it has a track record of economic development and economic growth. Not only during this period, but historically. It's produced more Nobel Prize winners, more sort of folks in the entertainment industry, more folks who've gone on to become contributors, both to the economy, knowledge development, many different sectors of the society. It is time now to make the needed and necessary investment in CUNY that has a proven track record in producing I don't want to just simply reduce it to economic multiplier, although that's critical. It's about citizenship. It's about intellectual development. It's about being in a society in a way that balances individual need in relationship to collective need. And never have we needed that kind of balance more than we need today, and the economic multiplier.
And I would say on that last point, which I think is critical, there's too easy a way in which this conversation devolves into economic stimulus. It's why we end up with this obsession with STEM and getting students into STEM. And and this is something we argued in it's never looked at social sciences contribute to people's both their broad education, but also their specific education as citizens in a democracy. We face a crisis now in this coming election, in part, because those things have been devalued. And one of the things that CUNY, throughout its history, has stood for, at all the stages, was that desire to educate as the first president of what became City College said, the children of the whole people, and education was meant to be more than job training. And my concern moving forward is we have to keep the issue of broad understandings about society and citizenship at the forefront of our discussion, because frankly, the CUNY Board of Trustees and even the current leadership of the CUNY Central, they don't put that front and center. They only put forward the kind of the instrumental economic multiplier effect. So we have to say, yes, that's important. Again, necessary, but not sufficient to explain why we need this.
Absolutely. But at the same time, democracy is fundamentally about inclusion, and anti-democratic perspective is about disenfranchisement. To the extent that we are disenfranchising Black and brown students on the basis of the quality of education offered and the diminished access to a quality of education, we are in fact on a platform of an anti-democracy, no matter how you want to phrase or rephrase it. Part of what we're arguing is a racialized austerity that is profoundly disenfranchising and profoundly anti-democratic.
That seems like a perfect place for us to stop. We welcome, people's comments. The article will be posted in the next day or so in the Gotham Gazette. We as scholars and as activists, we would welcome people's thoughts and reactions to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.